Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. In this one, what I want to do is look at a recent article that addresses an important question in skill, kind of this balancing of demands, right? So, if we look at some of the models of how we think about skill, for example, some of the models like of Carl Newell's idea that motor learning is a search through a perceptual motor landscape. One of the key ideas that he has, and this is prominent in a lot of other theories, is the idea that we have to kind of strike this balance, right? Between, on the one hand, exploring the landscape and finding a new solution to solve a movement problem. And on the other hand, exploiting a particular solution, right? Another way to think of it is a balance between adaptability, being able to adjust and come up with new solutions, and stability, right? Being able to keep your performance consistent, right? So, and there's a couple podcasts I've covered this. 158 back in 18C, I reviewed an article by Newell and Pacheco showing that elite perform people that do the best are the ones that seem to get the optimal balance of these two things, right? So that's kind of the problem we want to address today. Another way to think about this is in terms of constraints, right? We have our three types of constraints in our constraints triangle. I really like the way that kind of Franz Bosch tends to represent it in as ripples flowing out, right? These constraints interact, right? So we need to satisfy multiple constraints at the same time. Right? We have task constraints, individual constraints, environmental constraints, and the article we'll going to look at today is kind of framed in that vein. So the article I want to look at today is one published very recently by Crowther and colleagues in the Journal of Psychology of Sport and Exercise, and I thank them for sending me a copy. This just came out. This just coming out now. It's kind of in preprint form, and this is looking at cricket, spin bowling in cricket. And the framework for this is the main idea they want to kind of emphasize is that one of the things that a cricket bowler has to be able to do is adapt to different environmental constraints in terms of changes in the pitch, right? In particular, in terms of the content of the soil, whether it's made of clay, sand, or silt. What this is going to do is create different reflection bounce properties, right? In cricket, I think most people know you bounce the ball as you pitch it. This is going to change how high it bounces, the speed after the bounce, the spin it creates. So to be a good bowler, when you play what's called test match cricket, you often play in different places. You have to play in different countries with very different surfaces. Yeah, a good bowl, a good bowler is going to have to be able to. Excuse me. A good bowler is going to have to be able to adapt to this, right? They're going to need to somehow changing their movement solution to adjust to these different environmental constraints. Another way to think of this is you're not familiar with cricket. Another really common example in sports is tennis, right? Being if you're an elite tennis player and you want to win the Grand Slam, you have to be able to play on grass, hard court, and clay. You have to adapt your movement solutions to these changing environmental constraints. And one of the things they address and kind of the way they frame this trade-off is in terms of learning versus performance, right? So in motor learning, we tend to dichotomize these things, right? We have the performance learning paradox. We always emphasize when we talk about motor learning, the idea that what's happening in practice is performance in the moment, how well you can do in practice, which might be quite different than what you're learning, how you're improving in the future. The authors emphasize in their paper really nicely that sometimes this dichotomy doesn't really hold up because oftentimes, for example, when you're moving to a new surface, a new environmental constraint, you need to learn, right? You need to somehow search the perception model landscape for a new solution that works on that new surface, but you still need to perform at the same time, right? You're in a competition. You can't just do crazy things and not be successful. So we have to explore at the same time we're successfully performing. Another way they put it, we have to satisfy these new environmental constraints, this change in the pitch, while still satisfying the task constraints of getting the batter out, right? And scoring wickets and all those good things in cricket. So that's kind of the framework of this paper. How does a cricket bowler do balance this learning and performance, balance exploration versus performing, right? That's kind of the idea. And the idea here is that a lot of this is going to depend on how you're trained, right? If you're trained in one particular environment, one particular pitch type with low variability, you're likely to develop a very stable attractor with one particular bowling type, one particular movement solution. And then you're going to have to kind of adapt that as you go. And it's going to depend a lot on your individual constraints and how deep of a tractor. So the idea is, can we actually train hurlers and pitchers and, in other sports, batters, to be able to better adapt to these changing constraints, to be able to balance this exploration and performance? So what they did was to investigate this study was they took Australian spin bowlers. So these were expert spin bowlers in the Australian system. So spin bowling, if for North American people, it's basically it's kind of like a person with good off speed. So the good curveball slider, right? So it's not an overpowering fast pitcher, right? It's more of someone that has can create movement on a pitch, and very simply put. And so they took these Australian expert spin bowlers that were identified as being kind of high potential, and they asked them to pitch in three different conditions, under three different environmental constraints. A common Australian pitch, which they were very, very used to, and then what they had what's called a bespoke and international pitch, which they changed the soil construction, and I'll talk about that in a second, the makeup of the soil, which was unfamiliar to them. So, and what they had was have them pitch on that surface twice to see how it changes. In all the experiments, it was very representative design. They were pitching against a batter in a small-sided game, right? So they had to get outs, they had to make wickets, and so on. And one of the kind of the strengths of this paper, I think, is they used a mixed methodology. So they looked at both, questioned them, how did you change with the new thing? So they had qualitative. They looked at kind of performance things, like how much spin they put on the ball, so on, what speed changes. And then they also looked at outcomes, how many wickets did they get, how many outs did they get, and so on. The main hypothesis was that when they switched to the bespoke international pitch, which was the one they're not familiar with, right, they would somehow, you would see evidence that they're trying to balance the constraints, right? They're going to try to explore and be more variable and look for some new way to pitch to kind of satisfy so they can get outs on this new surface, while at the same time doing some things that will maintain their performance, right? Limit the number of things that go and score, right? So they're not going to go crazy exploration. They're going to do this balance that we talked about at the start. So more specifics, they had 8 emerging Australian expert spin bowlers, so people that identify with a lot of potential over at age 21. They went to a 4-week camp where they competed in these 3 small-sided games, which was been used in previous studies. So Ian Renshaw is one of the authors on his paper. He used this called the battle zone. It's a small-sided game. Again, the first one was on the familiar Australian surface. The next 2 were on an unfamiliar surface. And the specifics, the Australian one was 72% clay, 25% silt, and 3% sand, whereas the bespoke one was 28% clay, 28% silt, and 43% sand. So it's much more sandy surface as compared to the one they're used to, right? So a clear change in environmental constraint, changing the surface you're playing on. They measured a ton of outcome variables, the number of runs bowled, the hits against them, essentially, the strike rate, wickets. They also measured process variables like delivery speed, spin rate using TrackMan. And they gave basically 2 questions to them. Which one did you find, which surface did you find, do you think the scenario most accurately represented? What match format? And do you think you bowled differently on the 2 surfaces, right? That was the 2 things. And how would you change? Why or why not? So those are kind of the 2 questions they asked them. What did they find? Well, in the results section, they did a really interesting breakdown and kind of a structural analysis of it that I think is a real strength of the paper. What they did was and you can see if the figure here, if you're watching, if not, you can go look at the paper. They broke down the constraints into kind of the task and environmental. They further subdivided those, so a task constraint is, time pressure, an opposing batter. An environmental constraint is the pitch. Then they looked at how that affected execution, how that affected outcomes, and so on. So they did this kind of nice flow analysis of how these things were related to each other. How a change in the environmental constraint affected the action mode, right? How did it change how hard you bowled, how much spin you put on the ball, so the execution, the process, and how in turn did that change your outcome, how many outs you got. And I'm not going to go into all the effects. They found some significant effects. The main thing they found, though, was that when the bowlers are on their familiar surface, so the Australian surface, everything seemed to be consistent with the idea that they were mainly concerned with task constraints, right? What the opposing batter was doing, the time they had to perform. They weren't so concerned with the surface. Not surprisingly, they're used to it, right? They were focused on being aggressive, pitching the ball, in particular in terms of the length of the pitch, to make the pitch. They keep the batter off balance, right? So they've had to play shots on the front foot, move them around, right? So they were being very focused on getting the batter out, on the task constraints of how you pitch the ball and so on. And there was clear. So what I would call this, my terminology, I would say, is that what they're doing is they're exploiting their existing solution, right? Their existing movement solution. They're performing. They have a solution, a pitching delivery that works. Obviously not the same one every time, as we've seen in other articles I've reviewed, but the basic idea, it works on the surface. They're parameterizing, they're tweaking it to bowl the ball longer, shorter, so on, to in the response to the batter. They have this coupled relationship with the batter, and they're adjusting their technique. So they're exploiting their existing solution. When they were on this bespoke condition, the court, the one that they were not used to, the more sandy one, what they found was they were equally influenced by more influenced by environmental constraints, right? In particular, batters reported that they changed their grip, holding how they hold the seam, to change the spin on the ball, right? So they're actually adjusting the delivery because they noted changes in how the ball was bouncing in terms of the environmental constraint. But at the same time, they also were taking into account task constraints. So they're doing the same kind of thing with moving the batter around. In terms of relating it to other things I've talked about on the podcast, they were trying to keep the batter in this metastable zone, right? So it wasn't clear whether they had to move forward or back to hit the ball, right? Which is some ways good for the batter, but it also makes it much more challenging. So on this new pitch, there was evidence they're both exploring, right? They're changing their grip from way differently to what they use, and exploiting, right? And changing the depth of the ball and things like that to take advantage of their existing solution. So they seem like they're doing what the authors hypothesized, this balance of learning, trying to explore and get out there and find something new, in particular, a new grip on the ball, and performing, actually getting the batter out. Right. So I think that's a really interesting finding. And so the authors conclude um, that when the batter, the pitcher, the bowler was used to the pitch, they tended to use overspin. When they got an unfamiliar one, they're using side spin. So they're exploring different solutions with the change in environmental constraint, right? And the interview and everything else seem to agree with this, right? They're devoting more attention to the surface, how the ball's reflecting, how it's bouncing when you change environmental constraints, while at the same time making sure they take into account the task constraints. So there's evidence of this balance, and this is really obviously really important to give batters all athletes practice with doing this, right? Practice with not only changing constraints, but changing interactions between constraints, right? I think that's an important thing we need to think about sometimes, not just how one constraint is affecting thing, how is it interacting with another constraint? And a great example of this also is in equipment scaling. Right? When you reduce the size of a tennis racket, you're changing the interaction between the task constraint of hitting the ball over the net and the individual constraint, right? Because of the smaller racket. So I think this is a really, really nice study. I think this is a really important thing to start to move towards, right? Going beyond basic constraints manipulations and seeing how people adapt to changes. Also, how would they maintain this question of how we achieve this balance and how we achieve this trade-off, I think is critical for understanding skill. My one kind of limitation I would point out, and this is something that I struggle with a lot too in my own work, is the methodology, in particular for the data analysis, in terms of comparing, for example, the speeds of pitches in the different conditions or the spin rate. The authors use very traditional group level statistics, right? Particularly, they use analysis of variance. With only 8 participants, I'm surprised that didn't really raise a red flag with reviewers, right? That is, it doesn't seem like a good fit for this. And I think more individual level, different types of analyses, I think we need to start moving towards beyond the traditional group ones. They're really not a good fit for when we're going to understand how someone adapts to individual constraints. I understand, I understand this pressure of trying to fit in with traditional ways we do research and the traditional stats we use in sports science, it's a difficult challenge. And it's something, as I said, it's been a real challenge for me in my career. How do I change from what I learned, these group level analysis of variance, to something else, right? That's a better description, right? Doing an analysis of variance with 8 people really doesn't seem like a optimal way to do statistics, right? I think it would raise a red flag for a lot of people. But overall, as I said, I think this is an excellent study. I would encourage you to have a look at more of the details. And I think it's a really interesting look at how people adapt to constraints and achieve this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So that's it for today. If you enjoyed this and you got some value out of it, I would appreciate if you want to send me some value back in terms of supporting the podcast. You can go to patreon.com/perception action, support some of the new things that I'm going to have coming out, get some bonus materials like written transcripts and monthly meetups. And thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.